Great. Thanks, Nadine. Good. All right. So welcome everyone to today's Consciousness Club. It's the last one before the Christmas break, and we are delighted to be joined by Daniel Yon, who is Associate Professor in Cognitive Neuroscience and Director of the Uncertainty Lab at Birkbeck University London. Daniel studied psychology in Oxford before moving to Birkbeck to complete his PhD with Clare Press, and then he joined he after his first research post, he then returned to Birkbeck on the faculty in 2021, and recently he was a visiting fellow at the Institute of Advanced Study in Paris. He's also just recently written a very well-received popular science book, A Trick of the Mind, and he's now become famous and has been touring everywhere. So we're very lucky to snag him for today's Consciousness Club talk, and he's going to tell us about the private life of public confidence. So thanks so much, Daniel, for joining us, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Steve. Thanks for that nice introduction. Yeah, as the sort of title says, today I'd like to talk to you about a particular kind of conscious feeling, the feeling of confidence, and the maybe deceptive role that social interactions might play in shaping it. So the talk is really quite simple. It's kind of broken up into three parts. The first part, I'll give you a sense of what I mean when I say that we use these private feelings publicly to coordinate our interactions with others. And from that, you'll get two broad ways you could think about the connection between private and public confidence. Either that these are rather separate things held separately in the mind and brain, or perhaps that there might be a kind of leakage and crosstalk between these two things. That idea motivates the kind of second two parts of the talk, where I'll talk about some studies that are being done in my group. So to begin with, I'll talk about some research we've done looking at the way that perceptual metacognition might change as we observe and interact with other perceivers, and see how some of the ideas that we established there in perceptual metacognition might generalize to a different kind of conscious feeling, the feeling of conviction that we might have in our moral and ethical judgments. So to begin with, I think, here's a kind of picture which, as Steve mentioned, I sort of took when I was on my visiting fellowship in Paris of Rodin's Thinker, and I think Rodin's Thinker gives you a kind of intuitively captures how we usually think about kind of these sorts of introspective conscious processes of metacognition. So it's usually kind of bound within one private person thinking about the comings and goings inside their own mind. And this idea frames lots of lovely work looking at how we might do that, how we might listen to the unfolding processes inside our own heads to create these subjective feelings. So perhaps as one nice example of that, you can think of kind of interesting sort of Bayesian models that have suggested we might read bottom up the kind of uncertainty in our own minds to construct subjective feelings like confidence. So in this way of thinking, your sense of, say, confidence in vision would be connected to the way that different mechanisms in your brain can read out the precision or the noise of activity in your visual cortex. This idea has been kind of pursued in lots of lovely experiments, particularly in work that was recently led by Laura Gertz, who found ways of actually decoding that objective uncertainty inside an individual perceiver while they looked at sort of stimuli like these, trying to decode the noise around the stimulus from the kind of objective activity in the visual brain. And if you do that, what you can find is that there is this mapping between these subjective feelings and this internal kind of private noise, such that when people feel more confident, there's generally less noise in the corresponding perceptual brain region. You can then do lots of kind of interesting work to try and work out what's happening mechanistically. And so you can find, for instance, particular brain regions that seem to jointly encode this objective uncertainty that's kind of privately inside your head and the subjective feeling of confidence that you feel, as if what these regions might be doing is translating that internal noise into a subjective metacognitive sensation, perhaps. So I think that's a particularly powerful, interesting way of doing work on metacognition. It's probably the kind of modal way. Lots of people will study introspection in that form. But other researchers have uh, made lots of interesting um, interjections into this line of work to instead suggest that actually maybe when we think about feelings like confidence, we should actually not primarily think of them as feelings that are for monitoring ourselves internally and controlling ourselves as an individual, but consider how they connect to our social life. So this includes this kind of nice paper from Nick Shea and colleagues, which argues that the maybe primary functional reason for having explicit feelings of confidence in the first place is because they enable you to broadcast your mind to another person, or this kind of nice paper from Celia Hayes and friends, which considers that the social and cultural environment plays an important role in how we communicate these explicit feelings, but also in how we learn to discriminate our kind of internal mental world too. So to give you a feel of what that might look like, what taking the social life of metacognition seriously might mean, you can think of these lots of nice demonstrations of how the feeling of confidence is important for coordinating different kinds of social actions. So one of the kind of first kind of forays into this is this very nice work from Bahadur Barami, who found that if two people make perceptual decisions together, you get a two heads are better than one effect, which is importantly contingent on the way that people share their confidence attached to their perceptual experiences. You can think of this as happening through a sort of kind of interpersonal Bayesian inference where you weight the different perceptions of the different people according to the confidence they express, living that kind of leads to a sort of precision weighted inference between two people. You can see these sorts of kind of metacognitive sharing, though, not just lead to the kind of overt expression of confidence, but also changes in the way that confidence might be communicated. So one kind of nice set of experiments along these lines came from Dan Bang and colleagues on the phenomena they called confidence matching. So they found in sort of several different samples in several different countries the fact that people, when they are making decisions with other people, will tend to imitate and copy the confidence that they're expressing, such that, if you're working with someone who's got higher confidence than you, your kind of confidence you express starts to gravitate towards theirs. And you can even think about more kind of complex ways that these expressions might change, particularly when you and your social partners don't have the same interests. A really nice demonstration of this comes from work by Yuri Hertz and colleagues looking at the role that confidence might play in strategically advising other people. So in this really nice experiment, what the researchers do is they give the participant the task of advising an imaginary client who wants to make sort of investments based on some sort of stimuli that you're seeing, judging whether it's likely to be mostly black or mostly white. The key kind of manipulation in the experiment is that while the kind of evidence that you're making advice on can stay pretty consistent through different phases, the client can either be listening to you or listening to another rival advisor. And what the researchers find in this study is that the confidence you express depends on whether you're being listened to, such that if you are being ignored, you start to exaggerate the confidence, perhaps leading to eye-catching recommendations that are going to catch the client's eye. Whereas if you're already being listened to, you lower your confidence as though you're trying to protect your reputation when you're already being influential. Now, in all these cases, you might think this might not have much to do with the actual kind of subjective feeling of confidence, because in these cases, what's changing in the social setting is the expression of confidence that the other person receives. And a kind of influential way of thinking about this in kind of, say, different cognitive neuroscience models has actually been to suppose that lots of the social life of confidence depends on keeping separate those public expressions from the private feelings. So nice work from Dan Bang and colleagues, for instance, could identify particular regions which seem to encode the private sense of confidence you might actually feel, while other regions might play a more important role in turning that subjective feeling into an edited report, depending on who you think you're interacting with. Now, I think that definitely can and does happen, and obviously we can express confidence that's different to what we're feeling. But this idea of a really sharp segregation between public and private confidence was something that we thought about in some work a couple of years ago, and whether it would always be adaptive to keep those things completely separate. And part of the motivation for kind of thinking about this was one of the ideas in this paper that I wrote with Chris Frith, where we, and this is an insight shared by others, but we make the point that when you're trying to perform this sort of introspection about the noise in different systems in your own mind, it can be very challenging because of the way that noise kind of grows and cascades as you go up different levels of the mind's hierarchy. That can mean you're often pretty uncertain about the uncertainty attached with different kind of representations in your mind. And as a consequence, you might need additional sources of information to help disambiguate the uncertainty you should feel. And one thing that we consider in that paper is the idea that you might be able to learn about the precision in your own mind by communicating with other people. So, in that kind of way of thinking, the expressions that you make and the expressions you receive as you perceive and decide with others might not just be in the realm of kind of public observable strategy, but they might be an important source of information that your mind and brain use to actually calibrate the feelings that you have. And this is the kind of basic idea that motivates the two sets of experiments I'm going to talk to you about today. So the idea is kind of rather simple. It's that we think you'll have these private feelings of confidence that are kind of introspectively constructed on your own. You'll have the opportunity to interact with other people and to perhaps change how you express your confidence. But the key question for us is how might these metacognitive states change as a consequence of those interactions? And might you have different private confidence when you're alone again after one of those exchanges? So this motivated some kind of nice set of experiments that was led by a research assistant in the group, Einar Andreasen. And Einar had a very, very simple design where he would put people in this kind of experimental setup where they were making very simple perceptual choices, judging whether a cloud of dots moved left or right, but kind of at the same time giving this kind of graded report of their confidence in that choice. So to begin with, this was a really sort of simple kind of solo perceptual decision-making task. Then in the kind of middle phase of the experiment, the participant would observe the choices that were being made by another partner. And in the kind of final phase of the experiment, after this kind of interaction, they would go back to being alone again and doing exactly the same sorts of decisions they were doing at the start of the study. Now, in this kind of together phase, which is the most sort of interesting bit, the kind of joint decision making follows a sort of paradigm which is very strongly inspired by what Dan Bang did in work I told you about earlier. So here there's a kind of joint scoring rule whereby according to the confidence that you express and the confidence that's expressed by your partner, the computer will just select whoever is more confident in as a kind of joint choice, which determines how much you're kind of paid during the task. So this kind of is something which encourages the participant to attend to what's going on with the partner and how they're behaving. But the key manipulation in the study is that the partner is not in fact a real person. The partner is just a kind of rather simple algorithm who's either programmed to be generally high confidence or programmed to respond with generally low confidence with the same decision accuracy as the participant. So because we have these two different partners with different participants exposed to different partner groups, we can see how people's confidence might change as they interact. But crucially, we can also ask how might those changes persist as you go back to perceiving and deciding on your own. So here's the results from two experiments, and the kind of pattern's very similar in both. So what you can see in both instances is that in this kind of initial alone phase, there's no difference between the kind of confidence that the participants express between groups, which is not surprising because there's kind of randomly assigned to those two different conditions. There shouldn't be a difference. As participants interact with the different partners, though, we see a difference begin to emerge, such that in both experiments, participants are more confident when they're interacting with the confident partner than the uncertain partner. That, fundamentally just replicates the kind of prior work on confidence matching. The more interesting thing for us is what happens in this alone again phase, whether people go back to baseline or whether that difference persists. And as you can see in both cases, it kind of clearly persists such that people are more confident after having interacted with a confident partner in that alone again phase when they're just making choices on their own again. If you look at what kind of happens on an individual participant by participant level, you can see this shift happens because the participants are gravitating towards the partner. So in these plots, what you can see is the kind of absolute difference in the confidence report, such that anybody who's sitting above that dashed line is someone who's getting closer to the partner they're interacting with while they're making the joint decisions. So we looked at various different aspects of behavior to kind of persuade ourselves that what we were seeing here was, a kind of genuine change in what people might be feeling. And one way that we did that was to look at the kind of decision times that people exhibited as they made these choices after interaction. And what we could see was not just that the kind of expressed confidence would go up, but that after interacting with a more confident partner, you also made your decisions more quickly, which might be kind of consistent with you actually having more confidence in the choices you were making. And this happened both on the choices which were correct, but also on the choices which were errors. We also ran a kind of third kind of control experiment to try and see how much this would generalize to different changes in eliciting that kind of perceptual rapport. So this was exactly the same as the experiments I told you about earlier, except in this final phase, we changed the discrimination and the response such that rather than judging clouds that were left and right, participants saw clouds that went up and down and made sort of similar reports about those. If what people were learning was a kind of really simple generic response bias, we might think that it would disappear under those sorts of changes. But in that kind of experiment, we find that actually, even with a different scale and a different perceptual discrimination, that change in confidence can persist. We tried to think a little bit about what might be happening in the kind of minds of our participants as they were doing this sort of experiment, and we kind of tried to formalize that a bit with this kind of computational model. So in this model, what we kind of assume is that participants are producing a confidence report by taking the evidence that's present in the stimulus, but combining that with a prior belief they have about the confidence they expect to feel. The key thing about this prior belief is that it can be formed either by integrating the confidence you have privately felt over the experiment, or it can be influenced by the confidence that's being expressed by the partner during that together phase. So the idea here in the model is that you get kind of two different sorts of prediction errors on each trial. You get the difference between the confidence you feel and the confidence you expected, and also the difference between the partner's confidence and the confidence that you expected. And we kind of weight these two prediction errors together in a particular way with a sort of parameter in the model that makes it possible for you to learn from your own experience and from the experiences shared by the partner how confident you should expect to feel. If we do that, we find that that model that kind of it combines this sort of predictive learning and inference that can reproduce this kind of group level effect, but also it does a good job of reproducing what happens on an individual level. So we can capture the kind of sort of simple features like the empirical confidence of the participant, but also the empirical matching effect they show shows a kind of good correlation with what's simulated in the behavior of the model. So this is all kind of consistent with that picture that I told you about earlier, this kind of possibility that actually when we interact with others, we don't just communicate confidence differently and leave our own private feelings untouched, but perhaps it might be that we're able to take the experiences that are shared by other people during social interaction and incorporate those into these kind of seemingly private metacognitive states of mind. One thing that I could talk to you about is some of the latest work in the lab, which suggests this idea might generalize beyond confidence per se. This has been some nice work that's been done by a postdoc in the group, Benji Barnett. I won't tell you about that though, because Benji is going to be talking to this group next year, and he might want to talk about it then. Obviously, you don't have to, Benji, if you're listening. But the kind of what's been kind of really intriguing in some of the experiments that sort of Benji's finished off lately has been showing that it's not just that this kind of paradigm can elicit changes in the subjective confidence you report in a perceptual choice, but it can change the nature of the report altogether, such that it can change whether people say they're perceiving something or whether they are in the presence of absence. So that's all I'll say about that for now. But you may hear more about that next year. Instead, actually, I thought I would change a different tack and talk to you about ways that this thinking about perceptual metacognition and this kind of social predictive learning could actually generalize to a rather different sort of experience. So here, I've given you a sense of how we might kind of observe and learn from the behavior of others to calibrate our own perceptual metacognitive judgments, which got us thinking perhaps how could this process unfold with other sorts of subjective metacognitive feelings. And one that we thought would be particularly interesting to focus on would be the feeling of moral conviction, the sense of confidence we have attached to our own kind of moral and ethical choices. So to do that, we made some kind of rather simple changes to this experimental paradigm rather than turning it into a experimental task that involves discriminating a perceptual stimulus. We had people make these kind of ethical judgments about whether a particular activity or behavior was morally right or morally wrong. These experiments were slightly different in that because while no one had ever kind of investigated this idea of sort of moral conviction matching before, we focused just on whether the kind of difference in being alone or being together would yield anything rather than adding in that final alone again phase. But the idea is kind of rather simple. You're in some cases you're making decisions on your own and you're expressing both your kind of judgments of right and wrong and the strength of those judgments. Whereas in the kind of together phase, you're observing the judgments of another person. To kind of do this, we sort of started off really by doing a kind of experiment zero, where from 100 people, we gave 140 different prompts to these participants and just had them perform a version of the kind of solo moral decision making. So we gave them a display like this, where they would be given a particular prompt, and they had to tell us whether they thought it was morally right or morally wrong. And we're kind of interested in the kind of right and wrong judgment, but we're primarily interested in the sort of conviction, so the extent to which they feel strongly about the rightness or wrongness of this particular item. So when we do that, what we can do with that data is we can work out, we get sort of rank ordered list basically of which items tend to yield very high conviction and which items tend to yield lower conviction. So for sort of high conviction items, you might have people have a very strong sense, say that pickpocketing is wrong, or that recycling is good, or that planting a tree is definitely a morally good thing to do. But you can have other kinds of behaviors where people can give consistent judgments of right and wrong, but where it's harder for them to commit very strongly. So you can have, for instance, in this list, people think that things like eating on public transport or giving expensive gifts or drinking alcohol, they have a sense that these things are consistently right or wrong, but they don't feel very strongly about them. In that sense, you might see a kind of analogy to perceptual confidence. It's kind of a measure of how confident they feel in the commitment to that particular proposition. With that kind of list in mind, what we can do is we can create kind of roughly matched sets of different prompts and fold them into the main experimental task that I kind of introduced before. So we just take the sort of odds and the evens and create two different lists, and we expose kind of half of these prompts to the participant in this sort of alone phase, and then they have the other half in a together phase where they're observing the judgments of another person. The kind of key thing again, though, is that we're also manipulating the kind of conviction of the partner that different groups are interacting with, such that you can have a kind of high conviction partner who's expressing generally high confidence in those moral judgments, or a low conviction partner who's doing the opposite. That's also done according to that ground truth data. So it's taking what the conviction was in that kind of pre-sample and adjusting it by a kind of fixed amount upwards or downwards on the scale. If you do that, what you can find is a kind of very similar kind of conviction matching that we see in perceptual confidence. So here, though the label on the y-axis is different, you can see a very similar sort of pattern. While there is, this sort of descriptive difference in that initial alone phase, that's again, it's sort of spurious. These are just randomly allocated to different groups. The kind of key thing to focus on is that the people who are making these decisions together with the high conviction partner, their conviction ratings go up in that together phase, and the people who are in the low conviction partner group show the opposite effect. The kind of moral conviction they express is going down. One thing we kind of looked at to begin with was just to try and see whether this sort of effect really did depend on the kind of beliefs that the participants had about who they were interacting with. Because one perhaps not very interesting alternative explanation is just they begin to copy the marker that they're seeing on the screen. So to do that, we ran a kind of different kind of version of the experiment where we changed the sorts of cover story participants were told to begin with. So in the original version, participants were told that they would be seeing the choices of another partner, and this partner was someone who'd done the study before, and that's kind of what the marker meant. But in the second version, we gave them a sort of more boring non-social framing where we told them that they would see this marker, but it was just programmed to appear in particular places by the computer. So the actual experience that the participant has is the same in this version in terms of the kind of low-level sensory motor features, but it changes quite a lot what you think the marker might mean. And when we do that, what we find is this is just the first experiment for comparison. In the presence of this sort of non-social story instead, there's no effect. So you don't, there's, possibly if you squint, you can see a sort of slight increase in kind of conviction for the high conviction group. But, compared to the experiment before, there's no kind of clear conviction matching. And if you did the interaction, it's also even worse. um, that kind of gives you a possible situation where the first experiment kind of shows an effect, the second one doesn't. And so we ran a kind of simple direct replication of the first just to kind of persuade ourselves that that was a robust effect. And in short, it is. Here it's in fact even clearer that the groups kind of start with similar levels of conviction and diverge as they interact with the partner. And kind of so far, then that would seem that there's a kind of nice analogy between what we might see in this kind of perceptual confidence case and this case of sort of more kind of moral confidence, that we might show a similar adjustment of the confidence we express in these sorts of social interactions. Importantly, because of the kind of failure to see the effect in that kind of second experiment, suggests that it's not just sort of simple imitation of the marker, but it depends in an important way on the belief that this reflects the kind of behavior of another kind of moralizing agent. And the kind of final thing we sort of thought about then was how might other kinds of beliefs be important in shaping this kind of sort of social learning about conviction from others? If it depends on believing you're interacting with an agent, what other aspects of that agent might be important for creating or modulating that sort of influence? And here we kind of moved a little bit actually to sort of current thinking in sort of social psychology. So here's a nice preprint from Carina del Rosario, which takes a very different, sort of from a very different kind of perspective than the kind of experimental psychology of confidence, but focuses instead on the way that kind of group influence shapes moral expressions. So the key idea in this preprint, and I would really recommend you go and read it, is the idea that while we think of our moral norms as being very fixed, our expressions can be quite flexible, and they're flexible partly because we want to express membership of a group, or because we believe that our group provides useful information about what is right and what's wrong. So this kind of mixes together the kind of classic ideas of sort of normative and informational social influence, but kind of fundamentally says we should be showing more of this matching, more of this imitation in the moral realm of people who are like us, people who are in our groups. And this is something that we can express and could be kind of particularly relevant to our study, because one thing I didn't mention is that the judgments that the partner is making in this task are just the kind of population average from that initial sample. So insofar as those capture what most people think, most people might be interacting with moral agents in these experiments that are quite similar to themselves. And that kind of sense of similarity might be important, kind of mediator of this effect, according to what these sort of social psychology theories might tell us. So that led to the kind of final experiment that I'm going to tell you about today, which was a very simple twist on the kind of previous one. So here we go back to that sort of social framing, and the only change is to adjust how much the partner in the together phase is agreeing or disagreeing with the moral choices that you make. So we can denote these either as someone who's a sort of moral ally, who tends to mostly agree with the moral judgments you make, or a sort of moral opponent who takes the opposite view to you on the issues that are being presented. If these sort of social psychology theories are right, we might expect that the underlying mechanism is one of sort of group membership and affiliation, that we'd see more matching towards these kind of ally partners who share our perspectives. This sort of manipulation of agreement is something that the participants are sensitive to. So in this sort of sample, we find they say that they would not like to spend time with the opponent compared to the ally. They don't think the opponents are similar to them compared to the ally, and they also think that their opponents are morally worse people. One thing that I think is interesting about these plots is that it's not actually from any kind of positive judgment towards the allies. Those kind of mostly intersect with zero. It's just that it's not, so it's not that we like people that agree with us particularly, it's that we really don't like people that disagree with us. So the kind of participants can pick up on this information during the task, but it doesn't modulate the conviction matching. So if you take the allies, we see the same sort of effect, that participants will kind of gravitate in the kind of conviction towards the partner they're working with. But this holds equally well in the kind of opponent group. It looks a little bit different because there's this kind of spurious difference in the starting point. The kind of key thing to focus on is the kind of direction that the lines move in. And in both cases, you get the same sort of interaction between time and partner. Again, the kind of interaction between the two is not significant. The final thing I'll say, just very briefly, is that we can take that same sort of self and other prediction error model that we kind of established in Einar's first set of experiments on perceptual confidence, and we can apply that also to this sort of experiment too. And the kind of thing that we find sort of tentatively for now is that this does work. So using the same sorts of kind of computational machinery as might mediate this sort of learning about perceptual confidence as we interact with others, we can also recreate this kind of change in your kind of simulated conviction in that model too. That again would be consistent with this picture I kind of gave you earlier that, when you're interacting with other people, there are important changes in your confidence. One obvious omission at the moment is we don't have that final alone again phase. And I can tell you that experiment is being run as I speak. So I will have an answer for you. Though in the kind of moral realm, I think it could be interesting either way, in that even if we do find that people go back to baseline, it might still be important for understanding the way that we learn the language of moral communication from other people. The final sort of, I guess, sort of theoretical musing I had was that I think that these experiments, both across perceptual confidence and this more kind of ethical, moral kind of confidence, have implications for some of these ideas about the role of the social world in tuning up these private metacognitive feelings. So in this kind of nice sketch from the sort of Hayes et al. Paper, the authors draw out the idea that we might need to learn from others and from culture how to discriminate our own feelings and how to broadcast them. I think perhaps what these results might suggest is that there's a kind of interesting connection between those two processes, that they're not things that unfold separately, but that in learning to broadcast, perhaps we end up tuning in those sort of mechanisms that discriminate and interpret our own minds for us. To conclude, though, I hope I've given you a sense that while metacognitive feelings like confidence can feel private, they can change as we interact with others. At least in the perceptual case, I've also given you evidence that these changes can persist even when those interactive settings disappear. We can kind of think about what's happening in these sorts of situations as though we're learning priors about these feelings from our own experience, but also from the experiences that are shared with other people. And this generalizes beyond kind of perceptual confidence, the kind of canonical metacognitive case perhaps, to different kinds of judgments, like the confidence we feel in our own morality. We can learn about this equally from people who are like us and not like us in that moral case, and that seems particularly important because it means that perhaps by thinking about how these maybe quite general metacognitive learning processes unfold, we can start to pinpoint mechanisms that can allow us to understand how we might kind of transmit either extreme overconfidence or more kind of intellectual humility from one mind to another through the process of communicating and acting together. Otherwise, as Steve mentioned, I have an obligatory plug for my new book, A Trick of the Mind. So you can read more about what I think about this and other things there. But otherwise, all that's left is for me to thank the people who were involved in this work. In particular, you've heard a lot about work that was led by Einar Andreasen today. Chris Frith, who I mentioned, was a collaborator on both the theoretical and the empirical work. The people who funded it, in particular, Leverhulme Trust, which links to the final thing I'll say, which is we do have an open PhD position to explore some of this stuff further. So if you are interested in that or know someone who might be, get them to get in touch with me. But otherwise, thank you for your attention.
Great. Thank you so much, Daniel. So let's unmute and